O tēnā koutou katoa, ko hira pēsta ko ingoa, ko au ta member o te paitaka wāinga, tēnei ata, engari e uri au o Ngāti Kahu, Te Aupōri, Ngāpui, whakatohia ki te taha toko pāpa, Ngāti Parau, te aitanga maha ki te taha toko māma. E whānau mai au ki Uawa, engari noho au ki tēnei takiwā a Tāmaki Makaurau. So, tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnei ata, huri o ko pokaro ki tēnei kōtiro, Dr Jade Le Grice. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Jade to you people out there who are listening. Jade comes with a lot of heart and a lot of mana. Jade is she is of Ngāti Tūpoto, Te Rarawa, Ngāti Korokoro, Ngāti Whārara, Te Pauka, Ngāpui. Jade is the most recent addition to our Ngā Kaitiaki Māori panelists, and it gives me great pleasure in introducing her as the wahine who will do the mahi to use today. So tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi Jade, kia koe darling.
Ngā mihi whaia for the beautiful introduction. Tēnā koutou katoa to everyone listening. Thank you also to Miriam and Monique for being behind the scenes and making sure this webinar moves forward. So I'll get into this. Go. Whoops, hang on. Should we share my screen first, shouldn't I? There we go. All right. So today I'm going to be presenting on a research project I've been working on probably for the last nearly 4 years. It's a Health Research Council project, or funded by the Health Research Council through a Eri Hapati Ruhumuchi fellowship. So yeah, it's been a bit of a ride, a bit of a journey, but I guess I'm finally at a point where I can speak to some of the overall overarching findings, as well as some of the more specific areas that I've delved into through the work. So here we go. So the project's called Becoming Sexual Beings, Māori Recommendations for Sexual Violence Prevention. So what I'm hoping to do in this talk, I've got a bit of a plan, is to initially mihi to the people who've been supporting the work, give a bit of a background to what the project's objectives were, the rationale, some of the research design, and some of the methodological complexities that arise through the course of the work. And then I'll go into a little bit more detail around some of the sort of sub-projects within each phase, giving, I think, a sort of more intensive outline of one manuscript that's been accepted and is in press, and some of the student work that's contributed to this project. And then I'll finish by kind of outlining what this means for thinking about a national strategy for the elimination of family and sexual violence. Okay, so I'll just start off. This is a lovely photo that I took walking through the Waipoua forest. My project's been based in Hokianga, so I've been working with whānau from Pākānai Marae, and so part of my well-being and keeping myself safe during the process was to have walks through the ngahere, walks along the beach, just to keep myself grounded and connected to the taiao. Okay, so research, even though I'm the one speaking here, research is very rarely done in isolation, and usually there's a range of different people who are supporting and backgrounding the work. So just want to kind of mihi to some of the people who've been supporting this work. So Cheryl Turner, who's chairperson of Pākānai Marae, who's supported with community engagement. Participants who were interviewed in Hokianga and surrounding areas in Te Tai Tokoro, where the project's been based. Graham Mitter, who's the creator of Maranga Ake, a youth expressive arts program in Hokianga, and Irene Hansey and Lorraine Royal, who are Dynamics of Whanaungatanga practitioners based in Hokianga. I also want to mihi to my colleagues in support who've helped out with aspects of the research design, given advice and suggestions for the work. Professors Linda Nikora and Nicola Gavey, and also Kaumātua, who've structured spiritual support for the research project, as well, of course, as expertise in the area of mahi tūkino, prevention of mahi tūkino. So, mihi to Whaia Jude Hoani, Whaia Joy Tewiata, and Matua Russell Smith. I've also got a really amazing advisory group who I draw on for support for different areas of the work. So these amazing people supporting the research, and thank them all. And I've also had a lot of students who've been part of this work, some of whom will be, I'll be giving a bit of an overview of some of their projects that have been part of becoming sexual beings. Okay, so in terms of the project Rationale, I think there's certainly a real need, I think, for research of this kind, based on the kinds of, the incidents of sexual violence impacting upon Indigenous women in particular, but also takatapui. Also thinking about the ways in which, sort of navigating new spaces, whether that's sort of coming into sexuality and sort of learning how things work, learning what's okay, learning what's acceptable or not acceptable. So some of that newness in terms of coming sexuality means that it's quite a critical site of intervention to support rangatahi to actually navigate these new contexts safely. I think there's also particular discourses about Māori that are attached to, colonial interpretations that kind of comprise, or create a sort of sense of blame or a sense of problematisation of, for instance, Māori youth, or, even sort of gendered, discourses that suggest that Māori women are somehow passive, or that Māori men are somehow inherently aggressive. These sorts of discourses often coalesce in ways that produce really difficult contexts for Māori to navigate becoming sexual. And of course, if we think about the impacts of sexual violence, these are often they're often severe, but there's a wide range of different ways that people can be impacted by sexual violence, because often it's somehow fused with people's biographical history, kinds of experiences that they've had in the past. For instance, if there's been prior sexual violence or sexual abuse in childhood, but also in terms of what kind of resources and strengths do they have in their whānau to support them to heal from trauma and, create new ways of being that allow them to into spaces of mana and acknowledging their right to be pono and their sacredness and potential through that. I think when we also think about initiatives for Māori sexual violence prevention, we're also kind of working against the grain of national narratives that position Māori solutions, Māori strategies as somehow inferior or not enough. And that sometimes we need to justify our approaches as somehow benchmarked against an existing Eurocentric way of doing things. We also find that area or support services that are perhaps not kaupapa Māori informed or kaupapa Māori services themselves, we often find that when people engage with, for want of a better word, mainstream services, that there are often, whether it's an anticipation of a sort of racism or sort of microaggressions, or whether or not that actually, whether that actually comes into play in therapeutic approaches, that sometimes these supposed support services can actually be spaces of further harm. And we certainly see that in relation to the justice system, that actually kind of prevent people from reporting sexual violence as well. So, you know, I guess the overall context for thinking about creating and safeguarding spaces for Māori becoming sexual beings is quite broad and actually quite complicated when we think about these different areas of health, education and justice systems that they require more Māori input and the legitimation of Kaupapa Māori approaches to ensure that we're not kind of recolonising Māori people on their journey to becoming sexual beings. So the project aim, to put it really simply, is to think about ways to change the sociocultural conditions aligned with high rates of sexual violence experienced by rangatahi Māori. Now, this is not an easy question to solve or to think about, but is certainly one that the project aims to try to be some part in making these changes to ensure that our rangatahi can live lives free of the harm of sexual violence. Okay, so just to give a bit of background around the research project and the design of the project was kind of just developed to have 3 phases that were all kind of interlinked. So the first phase was to engage kaumātua and key stakeholders to explore mātauranga Māori that pertains to gender and sexual ethics, to mana wahine, to mana tāne, in order to actually inform a kind of body of knowledge that could be shared with rangatahi in phase 3. In phase 2, the plan was to interview rangatahi about their experiences and the mātauranga that they'd gained through their experiences and where they saw opportunities for intervention, where they found that there were areas of their sexual lives that were quite complicated and difficult. So for instance, thinking about the advent of new technologies, of pornography, of sharing intimate images, of online dating, these kind of new contexts that young people are learning about, well, navigating, I guess, in terms of developing relationships or maintaining relationships. So there were interviews done with rangatahi Māori, taitama wahine and taitama tāne Māori about their experiences. So the third phase was really, I guess, designed to synthesize all of this vast material to actually think about ways that sexual violence prevention resources for rangatahi Māori could be pitched in order to support them to navigate these contexts and spaces. I think as with any kind of research project, there were some anticipated, but the extent, I guess, of some of them was slightly unanticipated, methodological complexities and intentions that went along the way. So I think sometimes in research, we often don't write about these, but I thought they were quite prominent, I think, in shaping some of the directions of the work that it didn't feel right to just omit them. So I think, really importantly, one of the things that was, I guess, a facilitator to this work and made some of my work much easier was the advent of Me Too in 2017. So the kind of visibility on social media of people sharing their stories of sexual harassment, sexual violence in a range of different contexts, but primarily starting with the entertainment industry, really kind of exploded a space for people to actually be recognising that, talking about that, and I guess sort of being validated in experiences that had otherwise been quite closed off, or people wanted to sort of previously maintain some privacy in relation to and fear of I guess retaliation or having to kind of contend with victim blaming discourses. What this meant for the research, which was brilliant, but also challenging, it meant that I often, perhaps more so than at other times, had to actually step away from the research agenda in my interactions with people to actually support them. So I had a number of sexual violence disclosures from people who it wasn't necessarily in the context of the research. It might be at a hui or unrelated kind of context where people wanted to share their story of sexual violence with me. So it kind of required me to, I guess, sort of be a witness to people's stories but also refer people and develop, I guess, more knowledge into the kind of networks of support that were available for people to be able to genuinely manaaki them and support them into a space of healing. Following these disclosures. And I think, certainly for people who are reciprocally supportive of the research, it was very important as well to, I guess, be available to also support people who they'd come into contact with, to actually, be there to listen, but also to refer onto specialist agencies who could give them the support that they need. I think another methodological complexity that was known, but I probably didn't perhaps expect the extent to which this would perhaps become more of a primary aspect of the work, was the way in which a lot of the people I were engaging with in Hokianga and Te Tai Tokoro, who'd been working in a specialist role in relation to sexual violence for a long time, had actually been, I guess, sort of not only undervalued for their work in institutional contexts and also in relation to government initiatives, but it actually had some of their ideas stolen, which created a very difficult context for actually, having conversations about mātauranga Māori that could then be taken from them to support rangatahi Māori. So it became a really important aspect of the research methodology to actually think about and re-strategize ways that this could actually work to support the supporters, really. And I think the mental health inquiry in 2018 gave a really, it sort of put a lot of these sorts of issues into sharp focus, and the kinds of harms that can be created from institutional contexts that don't value mātauranga Māori, that always defer to a Eurocentric idea about what counts as knowledge, what counts as a therapeutic modality, what counts as a therapeutic model. And so in many instances as a researcher, I stepped into a space of advocacy. So actually being someone who was, I guess, writing back in different contexts or supporting people with letters of submission to the mental health inquiry to actually support them to get the recognition of the kinds of issues they were dealing with into a kind of the government's view. Another methodological complexity that I think a lot of people have spoken about at length, so I'll just keep this very brief, but I also encountered was working against a grain of new challenges such as COVID-19. So namely, having gone from having regular trips up north and connecting with people to suddenly being in a context of disconnection and sort of working through, collaborators or even my students' experiences of isolation and precarity, particularly for students who were working on this project as part of their research, but who also had, I guess, part-time jobs that were much more difficult to access. So, having to kind of support people to take a step back from the work we required, and supporting them to work on a sensitive subject while there's so much else going on. So for a lot of people, it meant pausing their work and to sort of come back at a time when it was a better time for them. It also meant, thinking a bit more about social media and the role of that in developing resources for rangatahi and, the sort of potential of connection through social media to support the well-being of people, but also as a means to actually network and share existing resources and information. So that became quite important, and as a consequence, I developed a Facebook group for Te Taikaraukuro practitioners to actually kind of share resources pertaining to sexual violence prevention. Okay, so that's just a bit of a project. Now I'll move into thinking a bit more about some of the specific phases and some of the findings, I guess, or work that's been produced through each specific phase. Okay, so phase one was interviewing kaumātua and key stakeholders in Te Tai Tokoro I had originally intended to interview around 15, but because of the popularity of the project, likely due to me too, I ended up interviewing 23 who were willing to share some of the issues that they were facing as sexual violence specialist practitioners, but also in many ways in terms of some of the broad overarching ways in which they were supporting people who've experienced mahi tūkino in a whole range of different ways in their community. I guess the sort of the shift didn't betray its original intention, which was, I guess, answering questions around what do we know about Māori understandings of gender, sexuality and ethics prior to colonisation, what Mātauranga Māori underscores sexual health promoter and sexual violence preventers' approaches to teaching sexual ethics. So there's still aspects of that that were important, but also kind of grew to encompass a sort of broader focus. So I interviewed a range of practitioners and community practitioners about their work. So not just clinicians, but also people who are volunteers in the community who were actively supporting people who'd experienced mahi tūkino as a part of their work. I interviewed artists as well who were sort of processing aspects of their experiences and actually kind of producing art in ways as part of their healing. And also included marae kaitiaki, so people who were had prominent roles at the marae, but who were sort of engaging actively in work to I guess kind of keep a lookout for any kind of signs of sexual violence in their communities, and thinking about ways of intervening in contexts where they thought that might have occurred. One of the really important aspects of this work, particularly given the challenges around thinking about how Mātauranga Māori has historically been appropriated from Māori, one of the really important kind of processes that I engaged in was ensuring that participants signed off on their material. So I wrote a summary of each participant's interview and put some headings on there to kind of indicate how I was making sense of the data, how I was making sense of their interview, and ensure that I got sign off from them before I actually could use that for quoting in any sort of publications or presentations like this, for instance. Participants were also given an option to be named in relation to the study, which I think was quite important in thinking about the for ensuring that their Mātauranga Māori was kind of connected to them and not just a kind of a researcher who happened to ask them a few questions about that. So there's a couple of outputs here. So I've included some students' work here. So we'll probably go through the top one, a publication I've written about those kinds of issues around Mātauranga Māori, but within a kind of frame of thinking of specialist Māori sexual violence prevention practitioners and thinking about sexual and reproductive justice and what that actually means for how we support help the helpers really who are doing that work in the community and mitigating the kind of harms that they've actually been through in doing that work. I'll also go through some of my students' work I'm very proud of. So Wencha Lim, who was specifically looking at spirituality as a kind of mode of sexual violence prevention, or conversely how sexual violence prevention informed by spirituality was a really important, I guess, theme within the research. Also Grace Jessup, who looked at the kinds of challenges at play for Māori men in relation to sexual violence prevention, considering the possibility that Māori men could be victimised, was sort of talked about as something that was often not recognised. And then there were also some other students who did related work, related projects, but collected their own data. So Morgan Tupaia looked at Māori kaiawhina approaches to supporting tai tamariki Māori in state care. And Nikki Harrison, who's doing some work exploring Māori survivors of sexual violence and the impacts that these experiences have on their whānau relationships. So a lot of these projects were kind of developed in order to, I guess, kind of move some of the key themes of the work forward in ways that yeah, I didn't necessarily have the time and space to do immediately. So it's been a great pleasure to work with all of these wonderful students. Okay, so just to give you a bit of a, I guess just a kind of brief description of some of the work I've been doing in relation to the sort of practitioners' mātauranga and safeguarding that. I guess a lot of the intentions for this project go back to what I've already sort of talked about in the webinar, but the main question was what challenges are encountered by Māori sexual violence specialist practitioners and community engaged in sexual violence prevention. So I wrote this up drawing on a pūrākau approach to research with a view to, I guess, take Māori ways of knowing, being and doing as normal, but also kind of drawing on critical theories to actually explore how a kind of colonialism was surfacing and resurfacing in the project in ways that undermined the work of Māori specialists. Okay, so I had, in relation to this work, there were three broad areas that I explored in relation to participants' kōrero. The first was, I guess, the ways in which Māori community agency or Māori community ability to be self-determining was often curtailed by, I guess, sort of government intervention or institutional contexts. So a lot of the issues experienced by practitioners were actually I guess, in their broader networks within community, were often kind of, undermined. Māori innovators and experts were often overlooked in really quite stark ways. So we'll talk about that in a bit. And that often the sort of Māori ingenuity that the practitioners were, I guess, working from was often disconnected from them, and also the places in which the knowledge came from that, created some sort of tensions and challenges for them. So I think it's really important to mention that a lot of the people I interviewed were often working from the smell of an oily rag. And I feel like this is a common kind of knowledge for a lot of people working in this space, but it continues to be an issue. And it's something that despite, in many areas, Māori specialists and practitioners speaking out about it, it sometimes just feels like sort of yelling into an open space with no one listening. But not only were these Māori specialist practitioners under-resourced, there were often limits imposed on what they could do by a sort of Eurocentric approach to sexual violence victim support. So they were limited by a kind of Western way of knowing and being. So one particular participant spoke about how, it also is mirrored in our national conversations. So in many ways, the sort of ideas around how can sexual violence be prevented is often defers to a kind of Eurocentric understanding, rather than actually thinking about Māori people who are working in these spaces and the kinds of approaches that they might hold. So one participant said, an impact, perhaps intentional and indirect, of colonialism is that Māori are disenfranchised from ownership of the conversations and solutions in addressing sexual violation. At the heart of it is perhaps a cultural conflict and the hegemony of Western beliefs based on revenge and tepid, if anything, attempts at rehabilitation, with the dominant society acting like there's no redemption. Once a paedophile, always a paedophile. So what this participant's kind of talking about is, the ways in which they had tried to enact practices of restoration in whānau contexts were often undermined by other approaches that just sought punitive mechanisms to address that, rather than actually thinking about the broader whānau and the context in which people are situated and the relationships that they have towards one another within a community. So in relation to this next theme, so for a lot of Māori, despite being Māori specialist practitioners, despite being in high demand, thin on the ground and facing demanding workloads, often when they're in institutional contexts doing their work, their expertise was often overlooked in favour of, for instance, others who could come in from overseas to actually upskill people around new ways of doing doing things. And so this has been written in other contexts for the ways in which Māori psychological models of practice are often invalidated in favour of more individualised and deficit and illness-focused models of practice in mental health settings, but also the ways in which a non-Indigenous workforce is privileged through a focus on a kind of clinical expertise that's related to particular kinds of credentials. So one participant who wanted to be named, Whaia Penny Norman, said, "That's something we're battling. Being Māori and working with Māori, we have different ways of working. We have different tools and models. Who defines what's best for Māori? Who defines what an expert is when you're working with Māori?" That's my biggest gripe, because you have all these psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists who are not Māori. I think the biggest thing is not acknowledging Māori practitioners in the field who are using their own therapeutic models. They're not really recognised. So, I guess one of the issues that often crops up is that Māori practitioners working with people who've been affected by mahi tūkino often require a sort of authorisation or sign-off by somebody who has a kind of qualification in clinical psychology or psychiatry. But often there are not enough Māori people working in these spaces to actually go around all Māori survivors. And so often decisions around what's best for these people are made by people who aren't Māori. And sometimes this can go against the grain of Māori specialists who are working in these areas with survivors, victims and survivors. So another issue that came up was how Māori ingenuity is often disconnected from the originating people in place. So Michael Norman, who's the partner of Penny Norman, whose quote I shared before, he described a school-based intervention that he developed to support Māori youth that was based in Mātauranga Māori, but also his own innovation in relation to that. That was then taken by an assessor from the Ministry of Education and adapted so that it was decontextualised from its Indigenous foundations. So he described speaking to one of the assessors about what had happened. He said they had these people there, including a Pākehā fella, who was one of the assessors. I said to him, "I'll put it like this. I had my car stolen. The one who stole it, did it up, painted it, sold it on to someone else. They did the motor, painted it up, reconditioned it. About 7 owners later, it's a classic car, goes to shows and that." I said, "Now tell me who owns that car." He said, "Oh, I knew you were going to say that." I said, "Who owns that car?" He knew I owned it. So I think, one of the challenges I think that a lot of Māori specialists find is that when they do actually share their information, whether that's sometimes with academics or with government agencies, is that the knowledge that they share then becomes disconnected from them. Sometimes they find that they're often mistaken for the recipients of that knowledge rather than the people who actually innovated it. And often they find it's then tailored to suit a European subject and not for Māori, who the intervention or the resource or model was actually developed for. So, it's not surprising that a lot of Māori specialist sexual violence practitioners are not often that keen to share what they've done with researchers. One of the other, challenges is that sometimes, when researchers write up about this wonderful knowledge that has been gifted and kind to them, is that then becomes a proxy for non-Indigenous people to feel like they have expertise over and above Indigenous people because they've been able to read these articles or these reports. So these are some really kind of complex issues at play for thinking about actually doing research in the context of Māori sexual violence prevention. So we really need to be, I think, as I mentioned, sometimes I've stepped into a role as advocate in this context to actually be able to support and mitigate the kind of potential harm that someone in my role can be doing. Right, so moving into further research projects from some of my students, my wonderful students, and I'll go a bit quickly through these ones because I know that we've got a limited time together. we probably want to have some opportunities for questions. Aroha mai, I haven't been looking at the chat because I've just been trying to keep focus on my kaupapa. But so Wercha Lim was a student who worked with me in 2018 who was really interested in thinking about decolonising, I guess, Eurocentric approaches to spirituality as a kind of vehicle for achieving sexual violence prevention. So some of the, I guess, the approaches that we looked at, we're thinking about how do we actually think about what relationships mean. What does it mean to have an intimate relationship? How might that be structured differently for Māori in relation to notions of mana, notions of tapu, notions of whanaungatanga, to actually think about how we are in relation to one another in the depth of that, the spiritual depth of what that means. So that was, Wercha's, some of Wercha's work. We'll be looking at developing this up for publication. Watch the space. Grace Jessup was an honours student who worked with me in 2019. So she was looking at a particular focus on tāne Māori and the kinds of challenging contexts that tāne Māori were experiencing as a consequence of colonial understandings of Māori men in particular. So one of the, I guess, main sort of points in relation to her work was that often we think about this sort of overarching idea of being the man, and that a lot of tāne Māori speaking into this project talked about the importance of challenging those kinds of ideas, because often what that actually looks like for Māori is a sort of hyper-masculine space of sexual dominance, often, not always. But actually, understanding that actually doesn't come from Mātauranga Māori, that actually comes, that's a kind of racialised understanding of Māori that is not part of our tikanga, not part of our world. Similarly, kind of thinking about the kind of binarised understandings of gender, that too is not part of our world, but it's something that's come about through colonialism that we need to deconstruct as part of a sexual violence prevention agenda. Interestingly, I think Grace was also looking at the ways in which for Māori men who had been victims of sexual violence, that there was a particular kind of space of vulnerability that sometimes obviously was paired with the experiences of victimization, but that actually sort of not wanting to step into that space of victimization was often a barrier for healing and actually seeking support from others. So I think that's another area for thinking about engaging in sort of sexual violence prevention that's specific to Māori men. And of course, there's also a wonderful student, Morgan Tupaia, who was exploring I guess similarly, some of the challenges that crop up for kaimahi Māori who are working not necessarily for oranga tamariki in the context of state care, but around the edges of the system. So the ways in which Māori who are engaged in community support for tamariki and whānau were finding certain kinds of barriers to enacting a practice. So she sort of talks about this idea of invisibilized colonial norms that actually, we might say, why is this happening? These things keep cropping up, but actually they're part of the system and how it's working from a Eurocentric basis, and a kind of a logic that assumes Western ways of knowing, being and doing are superior, and that are actively blocking initiatives from Mātauranga Māori, derived from Mātauranga Māori. Morgan also spoke to the ways in which Māori practitioners were skillfully navigating those contexts to push forward for approaches that were resourced for Mātauranga Māori, to inform the best kind of care for Māori children, often in sort of ways of trying to, advocate for Māori whānau and Māori children who were in the system. But also trying to kind of mitigate harm from children who were already in the system, and trying to look out for them and try and get them the best possible outcomes, given the difficult and obviously not ideal situations of the context of state care. And of course, there's also my wonderful student, Nikki Harrison, who's doing her PhD, focusing specifically on familial childhood sexual abuse and the impacts that this can have on whānau relationships. So Nikki kind of talks about, what does it mean? What does whanaungatanga mean when it becomes a site where sexual violence has occurred? And thinking about the kind of harm that sexual violence does to even our tikanga, our notion of whānau, when it does occur, and how people, I guess, are trying to sort of decolonize understandings of sexual violence in these kinds of contexts. It's quite so there's more work from Nikki to come. She's got a book chapter that's been accepted for publication. So her work's in development. Okay, so that was phase one of the project that was looking at key stakeholder expert mātauranga in relation to sexual violence prevention. Phase two was exploring rangatahi Māori mātauranga and their experiences of navigating sexualities, navigating relationships. So some of the research questions included: how do rangatahi emerge and evolve their sexual identities? How do rangatahi enact mana and agency in their sexual lives? What's it like becoming a sexual being in an area of new technologies? And who do rangatahi Māori talk to about sex? And are there any barriers? Fern Smith, one of my wonderful master's students, supported me with doing interviews with rangatahi Māori across Te Tai Tokoro. Rangatahi had to be between 13 and 24 years of age to participate, and parental consent was obtained for rangatahi under 16 years of age. And I must say, I was surprised that I had requests from rangatahi who were under 16, but at the same time not surprised. But it did mean, I guess, sort of treating very carefully in terms of giving them space to tell their stories, but also being quite cautious around ensuring that they were in good, safe contexts to be nurtured and supported following the research interviews. And in fact, that was important across all of the rangatahi interviews. Methodologically, it meant that sometimes I might interview a participant and then end up kind of asking if they want to catch up for a coffee or something like that later on, or indeed referring on to other health services, because, in those instances, the research agenda isn't the most important thing. The most important thing is actually their well-being. Okay, so in terms of phase two, so Fern Smith did her master's thesis exploring young Māori women and sexual agency, and part of that work we have been accepted for publication in a book. So that work will be coming soon. So Fern's project was titled "They Shouldn't Assume Our Lives Are Easy: Rangatahi Wahine Negotiating Social Tensions, Pressures and Harm on Their Journey to Becoming Sexual Beings." Fern did a really lovely kind of detailed analysis of some of the rangatahi wahine experiences of, I guess, sort of not so much sexual violation as such, but sexual harm through the kinds of discourses and social formations that certainly kind of limited their scope for developing and initiating sexual relationships. So for many rangatahi, there were pressures around ensuring that they didn't have too many sexual partners, because that would not look good. There were ways in which rangatahi were kind of punished or blamed for being considered to have initiated sexual relationships, and that put them into vulnerable positions when sexual violence did occur, and was certainly, created another overlay of harm when they sought support from others or sort of sought to talk to people about these experiences of sexual violation. Fern's first chapter explored some of these kinds of, contexts of Māori women's marginalisation, in relationships and sexualities. That also included, for instance, the kind of privileging of heterosexuality, the narrowing of scope for what was considered to be, I guess, idealised in terms of a sexual relationship. And then the second chapter kind of took more of a sort of deeper exploration of two particular narratives from rangatahi wahine about their experiences of sexual violation, but also interwove that with, I guess, narratives of atua and how a lot of their strength could be likened to atua and actually surmounting these considerable impacts and these harmful experiences. So yeah, Fern's master's thesis is available if you want to have a look at that. Okay, so obviously with phase 2, there's going to be so much more work to write up and more papers to come, but I'm just trying to work through some of the work underway from phase 1 before I really get into more kinds of detailed work in relation to that phase 2. So phase 3 is the kind of process that I'm at the moment, working through. So this was intended to kind of synthesize all of the knowledge and material together to inform the production of some good sexual violence prevention resources. So what mātauranga Māori would be necessary to convey to rangatahi Māori to support positive sexual experiences? What colonial representations require deconstruction to support rangatahi Māori to have positive sexual experiences? How do we facilitate conversations about sex, sexual desire, and positive or negative sexual experiences with rangatahi Māori? And what resources would best support sharing mātauranga Māori pertaining to sexual violence with whānau? So what I did was I looked at the full data set, the summary reports from key stakeholder and kaumātua participants, and the interview transcripts from the rangatahi, and kind of looked at what were some of the main issues or major issues that the rangatahi and stakeholders alike were saying needed to be addressed, but also how might some of the, I guess, a Māori informed approach, how we might think about mātauranga Māori informing some of these resources. So a lot of that came through a lot of the student projects that were developed to think about what that might be like. Also with some cautions from thinking about some of the issues that can be at play when mātauranga Māori is disconnected from the experts who shared that and then transmitted into new contexts. So, in some ways thinking about COVID-19, what it did was create a context where social media, I guess a lot of us were pressured into utilising that as a major mode of communication, but certainly demonstrated the potential of social media as a key site of knowledge exchange. So what the plan was and is currently is to develop resources that can be shared on social media that are appeal to rangatahi. So I collaborated with Evan Hastings from Theta, who produced Sexwise, a kind of performance-based sexuality education, to engage rangatahi creatives in performance-based engagements with some of the themes that were identified in the research. So we're thinking of like skits, spoken word, waiata, illustrations that can actually convey some of these really important themes in ways that are also informed by Māori realities, Māori experiences in mātauranga Māori. So there's ongoing work, working with some key rangatahi stakeholder organisations to support the development of resource content, to be refined with some peer review and released on social media. So what that means is that the organisations who are working with rangatahi also get credit for their work. So we'll have anything that gets released, we'll have a tohu from this project, but also a tohu from the participating key rangatahi stakeholder organisation to ensure that the work is actually mana enhancing for all involved, and the rangatahi who are doing this work will also be named. So the 5 themes that I've developed through the research have focused, number 1, on thinking about, being new, being different, being diverse, and thinking about ira tangata. So thinking beyond the kind of gender and sexuality and the privileging of heterosexuality or cisgenderism. and actually opening up that space, which, there's some great work being done in this space, but to actually think about this as a sexual violence prevention agenda is really important to actually create space for different voices to be part of that conversation. Second theme is around encouraging rangatahi to identify and resist gender pressures. So this might relate to things around, some of like Fern's work and thinking about some of the victim blaming or even sort of sexual double standard kind of issues that rangatahi are talking about, finding challenging, but also some of those, some of the themes from Grace's work and thinking about how some of the ideas around, being a man, how we might think about challenging those, how we can identify and resist those gendered pressures. The next theme was around thinking about identifying and resisting coercion. So I think the narrative around sexual consent has been so important and so amazing. I think sometimes it creates a really important sort of template for what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. For a lot of rangatahi, a lot of their experiences were very opaque. And so there were certainly areas where some people justified, or they were faced with people who justified their own behaviour or tried to put the blame on them when they themselves were victimised. So thinking about some of those more slippery contexts that might be informed by, for instance, gaslighting, people deliberately lying about what they've done in order to get away with it. Or, for instance, people manipulating a friendship in order to perhaps have sex with someone and what that means for understanding that friendship going forward. The third theme was around navigating sexuality online to offline. So there's been some great resources about that, but I guess it's kind of interesting to sort of I think it's really important to keep thinking about how these sorts of new online spaces are really kind of integral part to a lot of young people's intimate and relational lives. So how do we think about people's behaviour online compared to offline? How do we sort of understand what might be, I guess, sort of sometimes, someone might be sort of a bit cheeky, but actually, we wouldn't necessarily put up with that offline. How do we kind of create context of safety for young Māori who are navigating relationships online? And then finally, I think, sort of honouring a lot of the participants who talked about, for instance, experiences of childhood sexual abuse or even intergenerational experiences of sexual violence. I think, holding that space for thinking about intergenerational resilience, holding that kind of spiritual space for people to sort of see that what has happened to them is not them, that there's so much more than what has happened to them, and being able to sort of sit with self-compassion for themselves, and sort of, how do they think about sort of moving aroha into the future. So those are a lot of resources that are in development. But these are some of the instructions that I've sent to rangatahi who are participating, kinds of I guess reasons why we want them to be doing this work. We want to break some of the silence around sex and sexuality and demonstrate that rangatahi have the maturity to lead these conversations. And of course, we're hoping that people will sort of share and distribute these resources across social media, across Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And of course, share them on Ngā Kaitiaki Māori, Pākānai Marai's web pages and other relevant web pages. So just really quickly and one last minute before I wrap up. So obviously, I think the project speaks to the agentic potential of rangatahi whānau and communities to speak into the complex, multifarious and often intergenerational issues of sexual violence that encroach upon their lives. I think that's been quite well demonstrated through the work. So obviously the current government is working on a national strategy and action plan to eliminate family and sexual violence in Aotearoa, New Zealand, led by Minister Marama Davidson. So this is a considerable opportunity to harness this potential. So I just want to share this in case you haven't heard about it, that there's an opportunity until the end of the month to have your say. The resource Te Hau Tangata is really important. It was developed as a national strategy for eliminating violence. It's now going out as a consultation document. So do have a look at that. And lastly, I just want to do a bit of a shout out to Tawana Nest, who cover a huge breadth of advocacy and action in relation to sexual violence prevention, and in particular, Ngā Kaitiaki Māori, a whare that supports Māori motuhake, mana motuhake in this space to achieve the best possible outcomes for Māori, that Māori people, whānau and communities deserve the best. So ngā mihi mahana. Thank you so much for listening to my kōrero.
Kia ora, Jade. You just have a quick question here. Do you want to answer it?
Yeah, sure.
Do you want me to read it out for you, or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So the question is, although some non-Maori practitioners may already incorporate te whare tapawha, tūranga waiwai, whakapapa, and the importance of wairua, etc. in their work, until the workforce is increased with more Maori practitioners, what suggestions for upskilling non-Maori practitioners and better collaboration between Maori and non-Maori organisations?
I think solidarity with Maori practitioners and clinicians working in this space is probably where you could probably do the most, what's the word? Yeah, advantageous kind of work. I think it comes down, it's a tricky one because a lot of our Māori sexual violence specialist practitioners are overworked and often not available. But developing good relationships is a kind of key fundamental cornerstone of thinking about sexual violence prevention, but also in terms of our relationships with our colleagues. So thinking, and we know that Māori clinicians are often overburdened, overworked. So, how can you actually support in growing the Māori workforce in those kinds of contexts? In terms of what you can do, I think part of it's acknowledging the kind of the harms, I guess, of the Crown's violation of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, actually, and thinking about that as a basis of relationship that we now find ourselves struggling against in terms of actually being able to advocate for our approaches and our initiatives and our people. So I do think, activism, solidarity, getting amongst some of the awesome work by Tauiwi in the space. For instance, I think Miriam Sessa has been involved in, who's here. The work of people like Heather Kame, Tim McCrenna, Ray Meehan, and others, Nicola Gavey, for instance, people who are doing a lot of that work to support Māori working in this space. Oh, and just one point, so there is a questionnaire form in relation to this webinar, so please fill that out. Yeah, that would be amazing. Should I have a look through some of the questions? Oh, kia ora, Evan, awesome. And Debbie, kia ora. Kia ora, Susie. Kia ora, Shona. Kia ora, Terry-Ann. Kia ora, Rose. Oh, kia ora to Waibabarich, Unasa. Kia ora, Brody. Kia ora, Georgia. Kia ora, Karen. Kia ora, Melanie. Kia ora, Claire. Kia ora, Caitlin. Kia ora, Te Ara Pautama, Tauranga. Kia ora, Stacey. Kia ora, Kate. Kia ora, Bruce. Kia ora, Keegan. Kia ora, Charlie. Oh, kia ora Te Ara Pautama in Hamilton and Tauranga. Awesome. Kia ora, Akira. Kia ora, Annalisa and Lizzie. Kia ora, Mason. Kia ora, Andre. Kia ora, Cornelia. Kia ora, Emma Barker-Clark. Kia ora, Alice. Ow. Kia ora, Family Focused Sexual Harm Crisis Support in Rotorua. Oh. Kia ora, Family Planning. Kia ora, Anatoa Takira. Kia ora, Kathy. Kia ora, Yvonne Uri. Kia ora, Chelsea. Kia ora, Sally. Kia ora, Kellyanne. Kia ora, Bonnie. Kia ora, Ali. Kia ora, Rose. Kia ora, Robin. Kia ora, Alex Michael Smith. Kia ora, Charlie. Kia ora, Ben. Kia ora, Annette. Kia ora, Whai Heather. Kia ora, Eva. Kia ora, Whai Echo. Kia ora, Ben. Oh, kia ora whai, I think you're on mute. Kia ora, Charlotte. Kia ora, Amanda.
You're on mute if you want to unmute yourself.
Wow. Simply amazing, kōtiro. Kei rungo no atu o mahi miharo, o mahi pāna ki nā o, kei roto etahi o nā tangata. Your work acknowledges the depth of the awe within the depth of our people, which is owned and created by our Indigenous people. And I want to acknowledge, when I think of all of the ores, ki ora, ori ori, the ore, hina nui te pō o, everything about your kōrero is acknowledging the depth of the very ore. So ngā mihi nui ki a koe kōtiro. I'm looking forward to what this brings about. Kia ora. Tūtawa mai I runga, tūtawa mai I raro, tūtawa mai I waho, tūtawa mai kei roto. Kia tau ai te Māori tū, te Māori ora. Ki te katoa. Whakamaua kia tina, hui e tāhiki e.
That means so much coming from you.
Tēnā koe, darling. If I was by you, I would hug you. But anyway, well done. Looking forward to working with you, darling. Ngā mihi.